Hello everybody, this is Farah Hati. In this lecture, you will learn about the pharmaceutical industry in the United States from an economist perspective. I'm using Health Economics 6th edition by Santur and Noon and 6th edition Health Policy Issues and Economic Perspective by Feltenstein. I also use a few other peer-reviewed articles and online sources related to this topic, and all the sources are cited in the references in the last slide. This is lecture 1, the structure of the pharmaceutical industry. The objectives of this lecture and the other 2 consecutive lectures are to analyze the pharmaceutical industry by 3 elements of the structure, conduct, and performance. In this lecture, you will learn how to analyze the pharmaceutical industry by looking at the structure of the pharmaceutical industry, by looking at the seller concentration, buyer concentration, barrier to entry, product differentiation, and consumers information. In the next lecture, we'll basically present you the conduct of the pharmaceutical industry by looking at the price competition, promotional strategies, and product innovation. And the last lecture will cover the performance of the pharmaceutical industry with respect to the aggregate prices, output, and profits. Let's start with an overview of the pharmaceuticals. Internationally, the United States firms conduct over half of the world's R&D, research and development. The United States hold the intellectual property rights on most new medicines compared to the other countries. The United States is the world's largest free pricing market for pharmaceuticals. That's why the price of the drugs are highest in the United States than any other countries. The United States and France boast the largest number of the biotechnology companies in the world by a large margin ahead of the other countries. In 2013, there were 1,165 biotechnology companies in the US and 1,284 in France. Nationally, the United States biopharmaceutical sector accounts for 70% of the all domestic R&D and an estimated $1.2 trillion in economic output in 2014, which accounted for close to 4% of the total US outputs. Now, directly and indirectly, the industry supports over 4.7 million jobs across the U.S. and basically predicting the future market. In the future, the U.S. large elderly population, high rate of chronic diseases, and drug consumption ensures that it will remain the world's most important market. What is the structure of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of the number and size distribution of the sellers? We can see basically the statistics shows there are a sizable number of the large companies in the drug industries and a multitude of the lesser known a smaller firm exists, which they focus on manufacturing and retail of the generic drugs, and they are less emphasizing on the new drug discovery. And the new drug discovery basically is the focus of the larger companies, basically. Now, looking at the 10 largest pharmaceutical company by U.S. sales in 2010. The first column gives you the name of the companies, the second column gives you the sales of the company, and the third column gives you the market share percentage, which means that you calculate that by dividing the market sale for each company divided by the total market sale. So now, if you wanted to measure the concentration ratio of the four largest drug manufacturer, you can actually add the market share percentage of and get the CR4, 8.5% plus 6.1% plus 6 plus 5.1 and gives you 25.7%, the concentration ratio of the four largest company. In 2007, there were 763 firms in the U.S. pharmaceutical industry, and the concentration ratio, or the CR4, in 1997 was about 36%, and it was 26% in 2010, as we calculated in the previous slide. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or HHI, which is an alternative index to measure the concentration ratio, was 530 in 1997, which appears to be reasonably competitive from a structural perspective because it's much lower than 2400. So the another way of basically measuring the market power is looking at the therapeutic market definition, which offers a more appropriate approach to defining the relevant product market for drugs. So using this therapeutic market definition, then we can see that the concentration ratio based on static data on therapeutic markets suggests a more concentrated market environment. So here we have a competitive market, or less powerful, basically market power, and here we see more concentrated market. Another way of looking at the market power is looking at a 6-digit North American industry classification system, which we call NAICS, and then we can compare that to the therapeutic market definition of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of the seller concentration. So the therapeutic definition that you saw in the previous slide provides a better measure of the degree of the actual competition at a point in time, means that gives you the static current basically competition of the therapeutic definition just at the current time. But the NAICS code you basically employs the 6-digit code which is used by Federal Statistic Agency in classifying business establishment for statistical data. That actually the 6-digit NAICS defines the market more broadly than the therapeutic market definition, because actually it look at the degree of potential competition over the time, not just in a static at a point in time. So this is another way of measuring the market power of the pharmaceutical products. Now, in summary, based on the structural distribution number and market share, the pharmaceutical industry are mildly concentrated. Of course, depends on which indicator index you use. A few drug companies tend to dominate most therapeutic markets, and the dominant positions may not be very permanent because, for example, in 2010, Pfizer was ranked first with a net income of $26.2 billion, and in 2017, Johnson & Johnson was ranked first with a net income of $16.3 billion. So The market share are reasonably close among the top 10 drug companies, so they basically compete with each other very closely. This cannot by itself identify whether the drug companies poses a significant market power, because we need also to consider other factors that we mention in the next slide. So we also have to look at the buyer side of the pharmaceutical market and to determine the degree of the buyer concentration. So looking at the number, size, distribution of the buyers, we see that market is relatively fragmented because we don't have just one specific consumers. The consumers directly pay for a relatively large percentage of drug costs, but this actually has been decreased the percentage over the time. In 1990s, the out-of-pocket expenses accounted for 63% of all prescription drug expenses, and in 2010, the out-of-pocket expenses accounted for 19% of the all prescription drug expenses, for the amount of $49 billion. Now, so the percentage of the prescription drug costs reimbursed by insurer increased from 24.5% to 45.2% between years of the 1993 to 2010. So this means that the consumers are responsible for a smaller percentage of the full price recently compared to the 10-20 years ago. So if we look at the payers for prescription drug in 2010, we can see that the all private is basically the payers for prescription drug in 2010 accounts for 64% of the total cost, and in for the all government accounts for the rest of that 36%. From this all private, about 19% you have to pay out of pocket, and 45% covers by your private health insurance. So when we are looking at the buyer side of the pharmaceutical market, so that basically we can realize the demand for pharmaceutical product. So the consumers are not responsible for choosing which specific drugs to buy in actually in the healthcare, in our healthcare. So the demand depends on only just the consumer's taste. It's actually, in fact, it's very little depends on the consumer's taste, and it depends on other factors such as physicians' taste or basically preferences, and also depends on the retail and hospital pharmacies who dispense the prescriptions. So we can say that physicians prescribe medicine, and then this lack incentive to make the cost-effective choices impact the type of the prescription drugs can be consumed in the country. So what is the result? There are high-priced brand name drugs are prescribed when an equally effective lower price generics is available. That's why in the United States we have the highest number of the consumers or patients are using brand name high price compared to the other countries that the patients mostly they use the lower price generic drugs that they can be easily substitute for the more expensive drugs. So when we are looking at the buyer sides of the pharmaceutical market, we have to pay attention. There are two classes of drugs. The first class is the over-the-counter that are available for the patient without prescription, and that has the risk of course, self-medication as well. The second type is the prescription drugs that they are available only by a physician's prescription, and so basically that's the part we are talking in this lecture basically, and that's the biggest percentage of the prescriptions we are talking about. The buyer sides of the pharmaceutical market, when we are looking at the buyer side, we have to look at the third party that is working as a middleman between the patients and the pharmaceutical markets. And those are the third party influences the demand for pharmaceutical products. So there are four types of these third party. They influence the demand for pharmaceutical products. First are the formularies, which are the list of the selected cost-effective pharmaceutical products that physicians, hospital, managed care organization, and many state Medicaid use to prescribe the drug. And the second one is the drug utilization review, is to monitor the action of the physicians. So the action, basically they have to use this drug utilization review as a checklist when they wanted to, when they see the patient and they wanted to prescribe a drug. The third one is the required generic substitution, means that if there is a the physicians they have to actually consider if there is a close substitute, a generic type of drug, they have to prescribe that one over the more expensive brand name one. And the fourth one is the federal maximum allowable cost program, which basically limits the reimbursement for multiple source drugs to lowest cost. Now, although consumers pay enough high basically out of pocket for pharmaceutical products, they have a small influence over the choice of the type of the drug and the prices of the prescription product because of all these factors. And also the price controls on drugs sold to Medicaid patients depends on two actually factors. The first one is Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990s, which means that which actually refers to the lowest price charged to any other private or government buyer. And then the second one is the Veteran Healthcare Act of 1992, which refers to the prices of the branded drug purchased should be lower than 76% of non-federal average manufacturer's price. Now, the pharmacy benefit management or PBM companies serves as intermediaries between the health plans and both drug manufacturers and pharmacists. So this PBM with vertical concentration accounts, the CR, the concentration ratio of the four largest company, accounts for more than 80% of the market share in 2001. So this is actually the factor when we are looking at the market concentration from the buyer side. We have to look at the PBM market power as well. So what are the purpose of pharmacy benefit management companies or PBM? Um, there are more than 200 million American currently obtain their drug from the uh, through the PBM, and then the PBM serve as intermediaries between the health plans and both drug manufacturers and pharmacies, and for a fee paid by health plans, PBM negotiate the rebates from the drug manufacturers and discount from pharmacies. So the antitrust concerns involves the foreclosures of the competitors when the drug manufacturers acquire a PBM company. So acquiring a PBM, however, may actually reduce the transaction costs associated with the contracts between the two independent organizations. So there are um, a negative side and a positive side of the PBM as an intermediary between the two independent organization. It may decrease the cost, but at the same time, so basically, it takes the decisions away from the consumers. Um, so the consumers are not paying for the full price, and they don't have the choice for the drug they wanted to use. Um, so let's talk about the barriers to entry. Barriers to entry into the pharmaceutical industry depends on the government patents, which usually government gives to the pharmaceutical companies for a new discovery, drug discovery, for a legal maximum of 20 years. Now, then those companies, they discovered the a specific drug for the first time. So those are actually first mover or brand loyalty advantage, which they gain this loyalty advantage by physicians and consumers, that they prefer their drug even if their brand name drugs are more expensive compared to the other less expensive generic drugs. So means that they have a kind of low elastic consumers or demand for their brand loyalty products. And also these barriers, the third one is control over a key input. So these pharmaceutical companies industry, maybe they have advantage in some specific inputs to actually have the lower costs, or a specialization that they can produce this specific drug. So these are the significant barriers to entry that may translate into the market power and the ability to maintain the market share despite the higher prices. Although, for example, there are some generic drugs, they easily can be substituted for this um, brand uh, uh, drug, brand name drug, but it's still because of their own brand loyalty, patient and physicians, they can have a high market share compared to the generic drugs. Another types of barriers to entry is the government patents, that the government gives the innovating firms the right to be the sole producer of the product for a legal maximum of 20 years. Of course, this will take less than 20 years, but considering all the steps by the FDA, so that's the maximum of 20 years. So this does not guarantee that the company will remain perfectly insulated from competition, because sometimes the pressure from the physicians or other basically parties may expedite the FDA approval for some generic drugs. So the effective duration is often less than 20 years because the FDA takes a number of the years to approve product for commercial introduction, and it takes about 12 years of the research to successfully launch a new drug. Now, so we talked about the first mover or brand loyalty advantage, that because of the quality of the substitute, generic product is generally unknown. So, so this basically the generic drug. So if they are even they are completely substitute for the brand name drug, sometimes this confers the market power on the innovators of the new product. Sometimes it doesn't. Still, the first mover or brand loyalty, they keep their high market power, so even with the new generic drug entering into the market, still the brand name drug can keep their market share and high with the high price compared to the other newly entered generic drug into the market. So the barriers to entry could be because of the control over key input by basically the industry, by the pharmaceutical industry, for example, because of the specific chemical or active ingredient. They can basically be the only one industry can produce that exact drug that is more effective than the other generic drug. So the other generic newly entered to the market drugs cannot compete with them, and new firms may find it unprofitable to enter into the industry. The consumer's information and the role of FDA is very important because the consumers face three risks when they directly purchase the pharmaceutical product. First, they overpay or receive a pharmaceutical product of the basically with a lower quality, right? And there may be the adverse reaction to a drug, to sickness or death, and the third one is the purchase a wrong drug or take the wrong dosage, and so therefore basically fail to recover from an illness or injury. So these three actually risks may make the basically drug unsafe for the customer. So what is the responsibility of the FDA? The FDA must approve a new drug before it can be sold in the marketplace. So the FDA also determines whether the drugs should be assigned over-the-counter or prescription status. So there are two types. The FDA protect the consumers from the risk associated with the drug purchase and determining the drug status, whether this is should be over-the-counter or by prescription, and must approve the new drugs before it can be sold in the marketplace. And also the correct approval decision means that the FDA approves a safe and effective product, and the FDA reject an unsafe or ineffective one. So we are going to talk about the type 1 and type 2 error later. The bringing a new drug to market can take about 12 years and cost $1 billion basically. First, we have to do a pre-marketing. Means that on average there are 6 years starting with the animal trials, human trials, to receive the FDA approval. So that's 6 years. Then in stage 1, uh, so the pharmaceutical companies, they basically include the healthy individuals, uh, about 20 to 80 people, to be in the trial. And then stage 2, they include 100 to 300 persons with the disease to see if the drug is effective or not. In stage 3, they have to hire about 1,000 to 3,000 of the patients. Half of them take the drug, and then a half of them take the placebo. So this stage 3 is the very costly stage. The cost of the enrolling patient in phase 3 of the clinical trial accounts for almost basically 90% of the total cost of the clinical trials. Now, once the new drug received its patent and was approved by FDA, the drug has no competition, and the price could be kept high for patent up to the 20 years. So this is kind of also, although is a reward to motivate the industrial companies to do the research and development, but in another side we have to look at as a barrier for the new competitors to come to the market, right? So let's look at the consumers' information and the role of FDA by looking at the two types of the error. So, and then the question is that why FDA incentive is to reject or delay the approval rather than accept a drug. So looking at this table, so we have the FDA approved drug, and then FDA does not approve drugs, and in here in the horizontal axis row we have the drug is beneficial and drug is harmful. Now, if the drug is beneficial and the FDA approved the drugs, perfect. This is the win-win situation. So it's correct. This is a correct decision and it's a win-win situation. And if the drug is harmful and the FDA does not approve that, this is the correct decision as well. So the problem is in here between these two cases. If the drug is harmful and the FDA approves the drug, in that case, basically the FDA is allowing a harmful drug in the market, and the victims are very visible and identifiable, means that the FDA and the staff must basically explain to Congress, and there are a lot of actually consequences, political basically consequences, and based on this type of error. In type 2 error is when the drug is beneficial, but the FDA does not approve the drug. So in this case, still there are victims in the basically in the market, because those the drug was beneficial and could actually save a lot of life basically, and the FDA didn't approve that on time, so we lost so many people because of the FDA's error. But in this case, the victims are not visible, and nobody is going to basically ask the FDA why you didn't approve that. So in that case, there is no consequences for the FDA. So that's why the FDA prefers actually to delay the approval to avoid the type 1 error, or we can say that to avoid the identifiable or visible death. So the FDA places greater emphasis on preventing type 1 error, which is a false positive. And the, the statistical debt through the type 2 error, it's called a statistical debt. So there is no media reports about the type 2 error where thousands in need of the drug, which is safe, but it was actually not approved on time. So this is a type 2 error, which is a false negative. And so even if the number of the death here is bigger than here most of the time, but nobody is basically asking the FDA to explain because the victims are not visible, and they call the statistical death, means that there was no cure for them at that time, basically. Now, in summary, based on the structure of the pharmaceutical industry from the supply side, the degree of the structural competition in pharmaceutical industry is not easy to assess. Depends on what definition you're using. The measures of the concentrations are sensitive to the definition of the relevant product market, and the measure of the concentration tended to change significantly over the time. And the patents and brand loyalty create barriers and establish brand name firms. From the demand side, this is very fragmented by the use of formulary drug utilization programs and mandated generic substitution and third-party contracts with informed pharmaceutical benefits management companies places. This also make a little bit difficult to determine the market power basically in both sides. This is the end of lecture 1.